Chapter 23. The Con That is Scientology Today. The Catholic Church had a teaching known as indulgences. A sinner could receive a pardon for sins by confessing them and then doing good works, saying prayers and things of that nature. Indulgences were church doctrine even in its early days. By the late Middle Ages, some marketing genius in the Vatican hit on the idea of dispensing with the prayers and good works and simply selling an indulgence for money. In my mind, this describes perfectly the state of the Church of Scientology today. In earlier years, the organization obtained its wherewithal by charging Scientologists for the services of auditing and training, and by selling the materials used in training, such as books and lectures. Scientologists considered these services valuable and were willing to exchange money for them. Since the early 2000s, though, the emphasis has shifted to asking Scientologists to donate money for different projects in exchange for a pat on the back. In other words, something for nothing. David Miscavige has been selling Scientologists a bill of goods, and the con goes like this. In the past, Scientology's buildings were often run down and did not present a good public image. The first Scientology structure to draw David's attention was in Buffalo, where the city planned to invoke eminent domain and take the church building, which lay in the path of a public works project. Around the same time, the world's most famous Scientologist, Tom Cruise, complained to David that he could not take a person he was trying to interest in Scientology into a local church because it looked so bad, or so I have been told. These events spurred David to come up with a program that is meant to turn every Scientology church into an ideal organization. The operation involves buying a building in a city and then renovating it to make it utterly posh, which, the logic goes, will attract people to Scientology. To fund the extensive costs for these ideal orgs, David, through his minions, persuades public Scientologists to donate millions for the purchase of the building, and then millions more to pay for the renovations. This might be excusable if the building then was solely for the benefit of the local area. This is not how David works, however. From his position, he dictates everything of importance that happens in the church, which means he controls those considerable real estate assets as well. Although owned by the local church, the new ideal org comes under the management of the landlord office at International Management Headquarters, which puts it directly under David's control. It makes Scientology look bigger, and on the surface, as though Scientology is expanding. My son is nothing if not clever. Making my point even more strongly is that many services once delivered regularly in Scientology organizations are no longer available. Volumes and volumes containing all of Hubbard's organizational policies were once for sale. These are no longer available on the church websites that publish Scientology materials. An advanced auditor training course involves studying all of Hubbard's books, all of his bulletins relating to auditing theory and procedures, and hundreds of his lectures. This massive course takes at least a year of full-time study, and the course has been a mainstay service for Scientologists since the 1960s when Hubbard inaugurated it. That course is no longer available, according to reports about the Los Angeles organization, which delivered it for decades. Other courses that thousands of Scientologists have taken for decades appear to be in a similar category. None of those course materials are available for sale on church websites. Excuses are given for their withdrawal, but apparently it is far easier and less work to harangue Scientologists for straight donations than to actually deliver services to them that take weeks or months. A good friend of mine, Dave Richards, once compared Scientology in its heyday to what it is today. Richards knew about this comparison because for several years he was the director of the founding Church of Scientology in Washington, D.C. Hubbard was always keen on measuring how productive every church organization was, and the church kept weekly production statistics. Richards told me that when he was running the church, it delivered 1,200 hours of auditing every week, enough to keep 50 auditors busy. Today, those figures may well match the entire amount delivered by the 150 or so mid-level churches all over the world. The Washington Church regularly had 200 people in training to become auditors, and upward of 50 each week were coming in for introductory courses. For years, Mike Rinder has published on his popular blog photos taken by former Scientologists of churches in various cities, and they are largely empty, not only of parishioners, but of staff too. Predictably, the ideal org strategy has backfired for everyone but David himself. The parishioners in the local organization drained their bank accounts, maxed out their credit cards, spent their children's college savings, took out second mortgages, and otherwise accepted financial strain. The staff of the local organization, which ordinarily had difficulty paying the bills, now has much larger heating, air conditioning, and electricity bills. The new church is large and beautiful, but stands mostly empty of people because the parishioners have been pressured into using their discretionary income and much more to put the building there in the first place. David, however, has made out like a bandit, and I use the term advisedly. Each new ideal org adds millions in value to the coffers of Scientology International. The most important performance indicator of Scientology's management is called Sea Org Reserves, SOR, which is the amount of wealth in money, property, whatever, that the church has saved up. According to Mike Rinder, the value of these new church buildings is added to the SOR statistic periodically, and doing so paints a rosy picture for management. David micromanages nearly every aspect of Scientology operations, and certainly every important one, and you can be sure that these new buildings in the Scientology real estate portfolio are some of his biggest chips. David's position of absolute authority in the church brings to mind the analogy of a military strongman who lives a lavish lifestyle, while the citizens of the country live in poverty. David has well-appointed apartments or living facilities in all of Scientology's major centers, the headquarters in Hemet, Los Angeles, Clearwater, St. Hill in England, and aboard the Freewinds. As I have mentioned, he has only the highest quality food served at every meal. At the Hemet base, he had an exercise facility built that only he and certain celebrities, such as Tom Cruise, are allowed to use. Incidentally, because of my lifelong interest in exercise, I researched, found, and bought the equipment for the gym. The church furnishes all his vehicles and transportation, including motorcycles, cars, and vans. He wears suits tailored by top Los Angeles tailors, and once received a $10,000 suit from one for his birthday. And speaking of birthdays, every April the churches around the world pressure their meagerly paid staff to buy birthday presents for him. Rank-and-file Sea Org members receive a standard allowance of $50 a week for incidentals. Many weeks, however, this amount is reduced because of financial pressures, sometimes to zero. During some years, we were paid nothing throughout most of the year, except when it was time to shell out for David's Christmas or birthday presents. Still, after the weekly staff meeting, at which everyone lines up to collect their pay, someone is there to take 30 or 40% of their pittance to help buy COB a new camera or high-end mountain bike or high-tech gadget. The same thing happens at Christmas when different organizations try to outdo one another to express their gratitude. Make no mistake, David's position of absolute power is a comfortable and well-feathered nest. I recall a time when he walked in wearing a nice pair of shoes. "I got the shoes I told you about while I was over in England," he said. "Custom made." "Good-looking shoes," I said. "How much did they cost?" $1,500. I was stunned. $1,500 is what I made in the Sea Org for an entire year's work. At that time, Sea Org members made $30 a week, yet he had the wherewithal to drop $1,500 on a single pair of shoes. David obviously saw the look on my face and told me in a somewhat embarrassed tone, "You know, these really do feel different." trying to convince me that these nice shoes really were worth 10 or more times the usual price of a decent pair. All the booty David accumulates doesn't take a dime out of his pocket. Sea Org members are meant to be rewarded for their production. What they produce on their jobs is counted up weekly, and Hubbard recommended that, for stellar performance, staff should receive bonuses on top of their allowance. Dave has worked it out so that he receives not only weekly bonuses but also hefty year-end bonuses. The allowance that other Sea Org members receive isn't even an afterthought for him. A former RTC staff member who worked in its finance division told me that David would have shirts custom-made at a cost of $200 each, and he would wear them once. Maybe this was for special events, but still, once? Scientology is supposed to be a church. In comparison, other Sea Org members live like monks. Their weekly allowance would not pay for activities on a day off if they were ever allowed a day off. I have already mentioned the difference in the food allowance. As for living quarters, unmarried men and women live in dorms for each, while married couples have single rooms. Quarters are not lavish by any means. Sea Org members are furnished with uniforms, but when items wear out, people are expected to buy replacements, out of pocket. You can bet that church public relations executives will counter what I write by showing the beautiful facilities at the Gold Base, the soccer fields, basketball and tennis courts, running path with exercise stations, the 9-hole golf course, Olympic-sized swimming pool, the landscaping with manicured lawns and tended flower beds and functional but beautiful architecture. And they would be right. The facilities at Gold are first-rate. Of course, staff members work in the production spaces for as long as 24 hours a day, and rarely, if ever, get to enjoy the recreational facilities. At one time, L. Ron Hubbard mandated that all staff should have 1 hour a day for exercise. It was to be in the daily schedule, he ordered, and at times the staff was allowed this time. It would be implemented, and people would begin exercising. 2 weeks later, some emergency or flap would happen, and exercise time would drop out again, only to be resurrected some years later, again for a week or two. While David lives like a prince wherever he travels and flies first class or in Tom Cruise's private jet, the rest of the Sea Org lives like indentured servants, at best. To be truthful, though, I would not begrudge him any of the perks of his leadership if he had remained true to the humanitarian objectives laid out by L. Ron Hubbard. Instead, David has managed to do virtually the opposite, for purposes, it seems, of keeping himself and a handful of well-paid lawyers living comfortable lifestyles. I write all this to make what I think is the central point of my story. There is a world of difference between what I found workable in the actual philosophy of Scientology and how David has twisted it to his own ends. How did it come to this? How did a young boy who was an affectionate, happy, bright kid with a great sense of humor and a desire to help others grow into a man who surrounds himself only with people who suck up to him and lives a lavish lifestyle, while those who work for him live no better than medieval serfs? What is the catalyst for such an unfortunate transformation? I have concluded that it is the acquisition of power. Some who come into positions of power may be able to remain whole and true to themselves, but my son David has demonstrated beyond doubt that he is not one of them.